Welcome to ABA on Tap. I'm Mike Rubio with Dan Lowry. So without further ado, sit back, relax, and always analyze responsibly. All right. This is your ever grateful co-host, Mike Rubio, and welcome back to part 2 of our very exciting interview with Dr. Scott O'Donnell. Enjoy.
So I guess it depends on how you measure it, right? Because a lot of times you look at anxiety as behavioral things of
What
like,
does that translate to?
somebody's having
Well,
anxiety.
responding that's behavior too. I
Oh,
mean, it's
for
a
sure.
reflex. It's still behavior, still in our wheelhouse.
Yeah,
That's interesting. Does it start with a sort of, I don't want to get too far into the weeds here, but does it start with some notion of a sympathetic nervous response, which would then be respondent? And then what does that mean in terms of what your environment does as a result of the demonstration of those behaviors? So
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I mean, I think this is a really important question, and in terms of, there's a lot of crossover between what we do and mental health, and mental health is sort of an important buzz phrase right now, but it's hard to bring those worlds together sometimes, which is what made Matt such an interesting guest. He's really exploring those things in a way that
Yeah.
seems to bring the behavior analysis in, and I sort of relate to it in the way I bring my developmental pieces in when I'm working with clients. Is there's a sort of mixing there that's hard to describe. I have a hard time sometimes, just relaying the technology, the terminology correctly because of that difficulty and crossover. But yeah, what are your thoughts overall?
Well, I go to exactly what you said. How does it start? Right. And
Yeah.
from the way I see it, it starts as a respondent relation.
Okay.
No, I have no doubt, like later on, maybe there's some operant relations there too. But I encourage you, and I'm going to go even older. I'm going to go to one of the older articles that we have in your house. I'm going to encourage you guys to read Estes and Skinner, 1941. It's a great article, probably like 6 pages. It's not really long. It's a great article on Estes is ESTES on anxiety. And what they did was they had rats pressing levers on an FI schedule, right? So it was consistent pressing, but not like, very frequent, presses, but consistent. And then they did a 2-minute tone and they followed it by a shock. And the shock did not coincide with the response. So it's not negative reinforcement. And then when you see successive sessions resulted in this, like, I would just scroll right to the graphs there, Mike. If you're looking at it, you see this like depression, right? A marked depression of behavior during the tone. And you could easily see that on a cumulative graph. And it's kind of interesting. They did this with the same rats who were satiated. So you don't see, like, when they had like low drive, they said, you don't see like as much of a depression. You can't tell as much, which I thought was kind of interesting. And maybe that's relevant to practice too. And then they did the extinction procedure. So they had successive sessions of exposure to the tone without the shock. And this resulted in extinction eventually, but the recovery to like where it was normal and not having that dent in the cumulative graph was delayed. So I kind of look at anxiety like that we should be looking at respondent relations. We should be talking about, unconditioned stimulus and, unconditioned response, conditioned stimuli and conditioned response. But overall, I thought it would be an interesting talking point so we could kind of segue here to like direct causation. Because Matt was talking about how we think about something and then we make a plan and carry out the plan, right? And I would say that's like top-down causation, right? So you're talking about thoughts controlling muscles that lead to action, right? That's what we're talking about, and we're making that assumption, right? But there's another way to look at it. You could say bottom-up causation, and that's neurons firing cause thoughts, and neurons firing cause muscles to move, right? So there's another way to look at it. But respondent relations are bottom up, causation because it's a stimulus response. We're talking about a stimulus that results in a reflex response, right? So I would put that in the category of bottom-up causation, not top-down causation, where like, hey, where our thoughts are controlling our muscles, and then that leads to action. But back to the difference is really where it all starts, and I'm sure there's more of it, more overlap too between the two after a while if you're anxious for a while. But
you made me think
does it
about the
start with
idea of, so the trauma is another very popular word right now,
right?
and how that sort of represents, I guess, both of those models of causation that you're discussing,
Oh
or
yeah,
it seems to say that, meaning that over time, with something happening so frequently over time, you're either going to habituate and satiate and ignore it, or you're going to become overly responsive to it. So I just made me think of that. But just so that it helps anybody out there, you were talking about some quantitative properties of anxiety, Estes and Skinner. And there's the whole article's on there. I think it's Appalachian State, their psych department, that has it up for free. So if anybody wants to
yeah.
go out there and look at it, I'll be checking that out later for sure.
Yeah, not real long. It's like 4, 5, 6 pages, something
Yeah.
like that. Yeah, that's a good one. Well,
Come
but
on,
that was
asking us some hard questions, Scott. I don't have a
I like this.
It's like, well, initially,
oh, it's gonna keep. We're gonna go down a rabbit hole today. Just to
all
let you
right.
know,
I'm
this
ready.
is just a start, guys. It's gonna get deep.
We're
gonna
just
get real
looking
deep.
in. We're just edge of the rabbit hole right now. Okay, I like it.
And then I would ask you, is behavior analysis direct causation or indirect causation, right? And so this is different than top down or bottom up. Direct causation is like one thing directly affecting another. So if I hit like a combo shot on the pool table, like then the one ball hitting the other ball into the pocket is direct causation. But indirect causation would be like, what's the ultimate source? Well, that's me playing pool with the cue, and the Q-tip hits the cue ball, and the cue ball hits the other ball, and the other ball hits another ball, and that ball goes in. So the reason why I'm talking about this is because with radical behaviorism, we go to the ultimate source, right? Which is the ultimate source is the environment, and that creates a sensory input. So both operant and respondent relations begin with a stimulus. Either way, we begin with a stimulus, a USCS, right? So there's a stimulus input. So maybe we shouldn't look at it so much. And I do act a lot. I do act all day long, but I do, bring this into act that like, hey, we can be conditioned to stimuli, and that will result in like, our body's doing something, whether we decide with our brains whether our bodies want to do it or not, like our body's going to do this because it's a stimulus response relation. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Kind of. So,
well, where does so in terms of then now, I guess repeating any sort of behavior within that model. So where does the reinforcement part fit in?
For what?
For like your
anxiety?
billiards example, right? So like no, like the idea that getting the ball in the hole is one thing, just moving everything around the table and hoping for some slop is another. I don't know how if that captures anything of what you were saying there, but I guess in terms of now, looking at the cause is one thing, and then looking at now that occurring again would be my next question. Is what obviously there's an aspect of reinforcement, but again, where does it all come together?
Well, I think these are perspectives to take, really kind of like lenses to look through, and depending on how we look through it, we might see something different. So I guess, and which it works really well into, to segue into this, I have some questions for you guys.
All right.
Okay.
All right. So my question is, do you believe in this stuff? Do you believe in behavior analysis? Do you really believe that our behavior is determined by our phylogeny, ontogeny, and culture? You believe that our actions are controlled by the environment without any other source?
I do.
So, like,
I do believe
pure
in it.
determinism, basically, is kind of what you're saying.
Determinism. Do you believe in determinism?
I'm going to say a blanket yes, and then I'm going to recognize the general notion that in no way can I claim that always explains everything to me. There's always a margin of error. There's going to be some sort of unknown, and then I've got to be pragmatic about it and say, okay, so what did I actually enact here? What did I do in terms of the significance to whatever I'm applying it to. So that's where I would go. Yes, I firmly believe in it. And then like any other model, I know that it doesn't explain all of the variability or variance for me.
So my understanding of
Um,
determinism is that there's an environmental change that precedes all behavior, right? So is that kind of what you're asking? Is do we believe that there's always some objective environmental change that precedes all behavior? Just my
yeah. I mean, I have more questions. It's like
no,
I
but
have
is
another
that your
question I'm going to ask you after this,
is
but
that what
yeah, yeah. Do
okay.
you believe in determinism? Yeah. Do you believe in it?
I think so, with the exception of maybe things like dreams. I think are kind of hard to wrap my head around because I don't know what the environmental change is that sparks things like that.
Mm.
But any behavior that's like conscious probably has some sort of environmental change, but I could be convinced. That's a good question.
Mm. Well, do you believe in free will?
Ah.
So determinism would say no, right? Determinism would say there's always some relationship there.
Well, we'll get into that. So maybe there's some different flavors of determinism. We've only really been shown one flavor of determinism, when we learn about behavior analysis. But there are some different flavors. But yeah, do you guys think there's free will? Is there any room there?
Maybe that's what speaks to that margin of error that I was talking about, right? So I'm going to have to quote lyrics here, but the idea that, you choose not to decide, you still made a choice.
Mm,
And that's kind of where I'll sit is, yeah, maybe that's the margin of error for me. So yes, I think that if I observe my environment, I'm going to find some environmental tie. And then, what part of me then would make me go against the tendency to respond in a consistent way, right? So the idea that most of the time I do this, and then sometimes I don't.
mm,
I might comply with, a law enforcement officer just to make sure that I don't cause myself any other trouble, and then at which point am I going to push back? So
mm,
that's, these are awesome questions. As a behavior analyst, it's hard to wrap around the idea of free will, and then I've got to give it its due. I've got to give it its place.
I think that's where
mm,
Skinner said ABA or behaviorism isn't the science of behavior. He said it was the
Philosophy.
philosophy of the science of
Yeah.
behavior, right? To acknowledge that it isn't as
yeah.
predictable as
Yeah, I
sort
just
of,
I just want to I just want to correct you on that, Dan, because I
please
heard
do.
you say that before. Radical behaviorism is the philosophy of the science of behavior,
Hmm.
right? So that is radical behaviorism is not applied behavior analysis, because
Okay,
Skinner
thank you.
didn't make applied behavior analysis. He was into the experimental analysis of behavior, and radical behaviorism is made up of a bunch of philosophical assumptions, and they're required. If you're going to do a behavior analysis, like selectionism over
Mhm.
creationism, we're selectionist. We don't believe that we were created by, one thing, evolution over a creationism, pragmatism over realism,
Mm.
determinism over libertarianism. We'll get into that a little bit.
Empiricism.
Parsimony
Yep.
over complexity, empiricism over introspection, and philosophical doubt over dogma. And I like to think of these philosophies as like they're like lenses, right? And if you look through, you could look through this philosophy, look, and it's like a point of view, and you look through it and you see something different. And if we could look through like the lens of realism, we could also look through the lens of pragmatism, right? We could look through both lenses, and we'd see something different if we're looking through the lens of realism. And we'd be asking, like, how real are these stimuli, especially when your brain is filling in so much of the information, or
Mm.
brain
Mhm.
fills in a lot of the sensory information. Or we could look through the lens of pragmatism and say, instead of asking how real it is, we just say, is it useful? How useful is it? But I like to say that we're capable of looking through either of these lenses, but it's important that we align the lenses of behavior analysis. Because if you align the lenses, you can create a tool like a telescope or a microscope or something like that. And if you align enough lenses, then you could create a powerful tool, powerful enough to conduct a science like behavior analysis, right? So seeing it through these perspectives is kind of important. I'm not saying that you have to. I mean, I believe it. I'm not saying that you guys have to believe it. But determinism is one of them that I figured we talk about, especially if we're going to talk about freedom and free will. Determinism insists that all factors are considered, right? And that's necessary because if we're doing equations, we need to have all the variables, right? And understand what all the variables are. So that's necessary. And without it, there would be other controlling variables that either don't exist or in the physical world or aren't undiscovered. And without determinism, ABC data sheets wouldn't work, FBAs wouldn't work, FAs wouldn't work, they'd be useless. There would always be doubt, there would always be other variables in there, and then we wouldn't be able to figure anything out, or assessments wouldn't work. We'd be left guessing. But there are different flavors of determinism that you guys probably don't know about. And I direct you to Slife et al., SLIFE, 1999. He's got a really good taxonomy of determinism and goes over 4 different types. I'm going to go over them really quickly. And we've been taught about metaphysical determinism, and that's what you were talking about, Dan, that all events are the necessary outcome of antecedent events, like that. It has to happen. That the antecedents happen that way, and then the event happens that way. But there's also other kinds. There's metaphysical probabilism, right? And that's events are determined in a stochastic fashion, kind of like on a normal curve, right? And different levels of evolution result in different random variations along this normal curve. There's also scientific determinism, which is a scientific method will lead to the discovery of order and prediction. And because we're using the scientific method, and because we're using a quantitative analysis, numbers, right, then that in and of itself is bringing order to things, right? Like we're using a system that brings order to things, so we should expect that we would see things orderly. But there's also functional interdependence, which is like, really that we can't really prove causation. Even if you had like the one billiard ball hitting the other billiard ball, there could always be that situation where it looks like that. There's magnets under the table, and there's a speaker creating that sound, and everything happening at the same time. Looks just like it, but that's not really it. So I guess with determinism, we compare determinism, and we always say versus something when we're saying these lenses, like look through this lens instead of this lens. For determinism, the opposite would be libertarianism. And libertarianism says that choice situations include the possibility that we could have done the other thing. We could have done otherwise, or that it was a probability that we could have done the other thing. And they say that the choices we make determine who we are, that they're self-forming. And these self-forming actions result in our own free will because they arose from our choices. And libertarianism believes that not every event has a causal antecedent, making it inevitable. But behavior analysts choose determinism over libertarianism because it allows us to conduct the science, right? Because it, allows us to say like, oh, there's not all these other variables out there that we can't figure out. And it's really necessary for, prediction and for accounting for behavior and things like that. So there are some ways to rectify determinism. Like society kind of has an issue with determinism, and you guys have talked about it because if someone, like it's all about the control, that control term. And as society really kind of has an issue, especially in the judicial system with determinism, because if someone doesn't have control over themselves, then they believe that they shouldn't be responsible for themselves. So you have that thing where people can claim they're insane or something like that and get off, and they're not responsible for their actions. But there are some ways to rectify determinism. There's compatibilists, people who believe that moral responsibility and freedom are compatible with determinism, that more than one response option generally does exist, and freedom is not the ability to do otherwise, but that you had more than one response option, right? So that's how they see it. And there's also revisionists who see like that free will is something that is learned like a social skill. Like there's cognitive and social functions of it, which I can I can understand, I can relate to. And it's a behavior in which we ask ourselves, what do we do? And seek answers and make and enact a choice based off of like us asking ourselves. And this is kind of really relevant to Skinner's problem solving analysis, where we can actively think about things and create antecedents, even though we can't see these antecedents, right? That like bring us closer to the answer, kind of like taking steps in a math formula. And this gives us agency and this gives us autonomy. But really, like in the long run, I think like the problem is something that you guys talked about, like that idea of control. And Skinner talked a lot about how control was always the problem, the main objection to behavior analysis, people don't like the idea that their behavior is controlled. Even though you go to church and church controls your behavior, you're raised by your parents and they control your behavior. Your teacher in the classroom controls your behavior. Your child has needs, and those needs control the parent's behavior for fulfilling them. And when you play video games, and video games is really fine control of behavior. If you move your thumb just the wrong way, you're lose. You're done. You're cooked, and you lost. So our behavior, like I see our behavior, is determined by previous history of the environment and opportunities, brought to us at that time. But there's always that concern for that science that controls human behavior. And that's like really the label of our science. We predict and control behavior. And that old argument was a controller. But I really feel like control is probably not the right word for it. Or maybe like that word, us controlling them is probably like, and I'll give you an example. I'll give you an example of this. So if I asked you to come and mow my lawn, you guys, what are the chances you guys would come? If I said, Mike and Dan, come mow my lawn. Come over my
17
house.
degrees out there right now.
Yeah,
okay.
It's too cold.
All right. But if I paid you $100 million.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, right? So you'd be over. But then the question is like, who's controlling who? Because I had to pay you $100 million for you to do it. Right?
Yeah.
So like, and if I offered you $100 and $500 and you chose $500, right? Is that control? Like, because you're just choosing the better option for you, would you call that control? Where we would call that control, right? We would say that's controlled by the environment. And someone would say like, no, I'm choosing the better option. Someone gave me an option between 500 and 100. So I'm choosing 500. Right. So, I mean, it kind of makes sense that you're going to do things better the way that's better for you, but we call that control. So I kind of think of it a little bit different is like you're already under control. Like I'm not trying to control your behavior. In fact, for generalization, I need to return the control of your behavior to the natural environment. You're just under crappy control. Right now, your behavior is being controlled really crappily and it's not working out for you. Right. So maybe we could get it controlled in the right way by the environment in the right way in which you're like much happier.
There's a lot of sociopolitical themes that come up with what you're saying, and I think you sort of alluded to some of those. And even in some of the examples you're giving, so within the two options, or the two fees for mowing the lawn, right? Back to your point that there's options there, which then begins to constitute the idea of free will. I have options to choose this one or that one, and the idea that I'm choosing one that's better for me, whatever that means, maybe in terms of monetary value, and then that now speaks to that intrinsic or extrinsic motivation, the idea that what would make me choose to go mow your lawn just because Dr. Scott's a cool guy, right? And it's not 17 degrees. So yeah, I've got a million things to say. I'm trying to pick one good one, but the sociopolitical themes that come up with what you're saying, we alluded to some of those earlier that I think fit the current. I think there's a lot of important questions. And the one thing I wanted to say too is I think that what you were describing, I kept thinking that we have to, you said lenses, and we have to create these models, I think, in order to be able to take a snapshot of those things with which we're observing, knowing that we're not going to capture are the variables, and even our best, most comprehensive equation is going to end with a plus E at the end for some level of margin of error, right? You know that nothing is going to capture all the variance, all the variability. But if it captures enough, then we can apply this notion of control, the idea that I can predict, I can bet the right team based on my analysis, 30% of the time. Wow, that's an incredible level of control when we're talking about gambling. And then that wouldn't bode so well for, a teacher in a classroom with a problematic student who's only completing 30% of their work, for example. So,
you said the equations, you mentioned the equations and I've seen equations. I mean, I've seen stuff that is, capturing and accounting for 99% of Ohtani's pitches, whether there's like fastball and breaking ball and like play calling in the NFL, where there's a run or pass and, accounting for and predicting all that stuff. And, just to let you know where we're at, like with those equations, I think it's kind of interesting that that we can't predict the next response. We can't
Yeah.
predict what someone's going to do next,
Yeah.
but we're very good at predicting these general patterns of behavior. So we can use a matching law and kind of like, look at like what we would call a molar view of things. And we could use our quantitative analysis of behavior and be able to predict behavior on a molar view, which I think is like really fascinating. And we have like generalized matching law, we have delayed discounting and probability discounting. You need to predict choices. We have behavioral momentum to predict extinction. We have functional analyses to predict current and future operant functions. It's kind of our goal. But in that, like that, we can only look at it on a molar scale. And we have used, like Newtonian physics to create behavioral momentum equation. I think about how in quantum mechanics, when you look at things in like a molecular scale, like they're saying you can't figure out the position of a molecule, of an atom, and that because it's all about probability, it could be in one place or the other. And maybe that's the same way with behavior. When we look at behavior on a molecular scale, we can't predict what happens next, only probability, of like it could be this one behavior or the other, and what the probability of that is.
That's interesting. In that sense, the idea of even instructional control is now based on the past, not necessarily the
Yeah.
next response. I mean, I think that captures a whole lot of it in terms of, again, having to create a model with which we then observe, track some, quantify some level, quantify to some level, and then that's how we define it. So it's always reflecting back, not necessarily moving forward. Yeah, yeah.
I
And I
mean,
can,
the ABC is always going to have some variability in it, right?
yeah,
Maybe you go to work every day, but so antecedent, whatever, 9 o'clock in the morning. And if you want to get into the thought, the radical piece, you think, okay, I'm going to go to work. Then you go to work, consequence, you get paid. But there's some variability. Maybe you're sick, maybe something happens. So it's not going to be able to be predicted with 100%. Nothing's really going to be able to be predicted with 100%. So I guess that's kind of what you're getting at with the free will piece.
Yeah,
Dr. John, is that we're not going to be
yeah,
able to
like
predict it?
overall, we're pretty close to 100%. Like if we're predicting things on a molar scale, like we're looking at behavior over longer periods of time and, stuff like that. Like, so like larger patterns behavior, but just when we look at it closer, like even with animals, even within the lab, like
yeah.
even if you have the most controlled conditions that you still aren't going to be able to predict what that little chick or that bird is going to do next. So I don't know. It's an interesting place to be in behavior analysis, but I think that is kind of like makes so much sense because that's what you see in quantum physics too. It's like really is kind of the same thing that they can predict, generally what atoms are going to do together. But if they're going to look at like what a single atom is going to do, it's like really hard. They're not able to do it, and they can only predict it in probability. But there's some concepts that I think ethically to consider here, like because we talk about like agency and autonomy and person and being person centered and stuff like that, and our therapies and stuff like that. So like that, I feel like that ties into it. Like agency is that they can make decisions and act independently, right? And then autonomy is empowering them to make their own choices. Where we teach them to do this. So that is determined by the environment if we're teaching them autonomy, but so these things can be, determined by the environment, but they lead to free will. And then even like it being person centered and like their self determination. But you guys kind of, when you think about it, you guys really promote autonomy and people like with autism and intellectual disabilities. Do you look at it that you're making them more free? Because it's kind of the way I look at it.
It's, man, that's a huge question, and I'm glad you ask it because it's a constant evaluation for me. It's moment to moment. It's because ultimately it's me and the parents, right, kind of deciding what's best for these individuals, and there's a certain restriction that's going to hit inevitably based on that individual's overall motivation to engage in a certain task. So I'll give you a really simple example. The idea that it might be really functionally relevant for a 13-year-old to learn to fold his t-shirts. And then you have to ask yourself the question, does the family fold their clothes to begin with? So there's like an application piece to it where okay, yeah, this makes a lot of sense, and it's correct, and this assessment tells me that this is a particular skill, or we can get into developmental milestones, and then it always comes down to, I've been talking about optics a lot. It always comes down to what can I get this individual, this child, for example, to do that then provides them more access and then more access to reinforcement, from their environment. And we've been doing a lot of work in schools, and a lot of that isn't necessarily that I come up with some that I'm able to motivate some drastic change or that my staff is, but a lot of times it's what we change in terms of now a new perspective from their environment, say their teachers. So the idea that Johnny does this, this, and this, and now Johnny doesn't do this as much as I thought he was, and now I'm giving Johnny a whole new level of access. And so
Mm,
it's interesting to back to your question. I hope that that's what we achieve, that we are providing, individuals with more options and more freedom. And then I would counter that. My margin of error there would be that it's a constant evaluation of, am I
mm,
doing this? How much of this is for them? And then how much of this translates into what I think and what their parents think is best for them? And how does it all play out? I hope
mm.
that made some sort of sense.
It seems like
Yeah, it does.
um,
Yeah.
it feels like with that question like that, what we're trying to do is just reinforce parents for being consistent with the A's, but maybe the C's, the consequences. And then with that, we're promoting autonomy to say, if you do behavior A, you get consequence A. If you do behavior B, you get consequence B. So we're not telling you what behavior you need to do. We're setting up environments that are going to be consistent enough so they're predictable, and you have the autonomy to choose whatever behavior you want or whatever consequence you want through the behaviors that have been associated with that.
Mm. Yeah, I'm lucky. I have my colleagues at Temple, Matt Tincani and Art Dowdy wrote
Mm.
an article with Matt Broadhead in 2024 about how ABA promotes autonomy in people with disabilities. And I was reading that and I was thinking how like people in ABA have fought for the right for an appropriate education for these clients, and we're constantly, like you said, evaluating our programs and our education. I mean, unlike teachers, they evaluate the students. We're evaluating ourselves and our ability to teach them. We take that technology of teaching approach that there's no such thing as a bad student,
Mm.
just as a bad teacher. And we do preference assessments and we do reinforcement assessments, and we believe coercion has its fallouts and we avoid it and stuff like that. And I, all these things that we do in autism, and like I feel like that's like what we're doing. We are helping them be more free. I get it that sometimes that fight for freedom is not without bloodshed. When you look at the American Revolution, what
Right.
did we have to go through to have freedom? So I understand that, like, yeah, there's probably some pushback on it, but it doesn't mean that it's not a fight worth fighting.
For sure.
No,
It's
no, I agree. Yeah.
yeah, I also think about too, like when we think about autonomy or the masking, which is a common thing that kind of goes
Mm.
with that, because I feel like the masking ideas were challenging somebody's autonomy. It comes with, and again, these are questions that they've been first posed to us right now, so I haven't had like a lot of time to prepare answers.
Like it.
But my thought, yeah, I love it. It's hopefully I don't, put my foot in my mouth. Is that autonomy piece is so in the example, right? So we tell parents or we support parents on setting up consistent antecedents and more so consequences for certain behaviors. Is that is that now affecting somebody's autonomy? So now parents are setting up situations where certain consequences are contingent on certain behaviors that the parents want, and therefore to access those consequences, they have to engage in those behaviors to get access to the consequence. Are we now changing somebody's autonomy to be able to do what they want because that's not going to get the consequence in the environment currently? Did that make sense?
Well, I guess you're changing. Well, I feel like they're already under the control of the environment. So you're not changing their autonomy. You're just shifting the control of the environment. So they have other, behaviors they can engage in.
But then if historically, at least sometimes in practice, I feel like ABA has been very rigid with the behaviors that they can engage in to say you can only do X behavior to get reinforcement, where maybe there are a lot of generalized behaviors that the environment presumably would accept, but maybe in the practice at that time, it's been so rigid that we're only accepting X behavior when maybe we could accept XYZ behavior, which might lead to more autonomy.
I mean, if you go back to behavior mod, I don't know. It depends on the way you look at it. I mean, some people have looked at it as like, well, what's the most effective and efficient way for me to change this behavior? And if you go back to behavior mod, that's when they use punishment. Do we use punishment too? But that was like really, literally just us taking our technology directly out of the, the experimental setting and, applying it. So we didn't have like the same like, oh, maybe we shouldn't be using, punishment. But then again, I've seen people make the argument that if that's the quickest way to help a client, and then when you think about it, you do want to have a right to, how would I put it, have engage in a little pain for long-term reinforcement. By that, I mean,
Mm.
like think about like a vaccine or something like that, right? Like there's no immediate benefit for a vaccine. In fact, it hurts. You get a piece of metal stuck in your arm, and then you get some liquid squirted into your arm. But there is a long-term benefit for it, and like we should, that should be someone's right to be able to do that. Like I can put up with this short-term pain so I could have this long-term benefit.
Yeah, if you're a bicyclist, you probably go to exhaustion, right? It's probably uncomfortable, it's probably painful, but you do that long enough, you build up tolerance, and then you can bike farther. So sure, that makes sense.
Mm, yeah,
You
and
mentioned agency, and it
yeah,
inevitably makes me think of Bandura's work and sort of the social cognitive
yeah.
piece to that. So that I might have to revisit some of that now that you mentioned that. He had so there was the three models, I guess, that he broke down. I'm sure are out there. I don't know if he was the originator, but there's the idea of personal agency, and then proxy agency, and then collective agency. And I think we sort of alluded to all three levels of that in terms of the idea of free will, and then how interdependent our notion of free will is on others in our environment. In many ways, we have to count on certain people to do certain things, maybe act collectively to do certain things in order for us to actually achieve that free will. So it's really layered. And I go back to your example of lenses, which I think allow us to take, I don't know if this analogy or this metaphor will work, but the idea that through a microscope you're going to look at a virus and you can see the virus and you can see the form and you can see what it looks like and you can call it something, and then it still stands to see what that microorganism does in terms of its communication and proliferation from organism to organism, right? So it's like you can look at something in a lens and understand it in a certain way, and then it still has to go out and do something for you to see what it's worth or what its value is.
Hmm. Yeah, no doubt. So I know I talked about free. I just dropped like $5. Whoops. And I know I talked about free will. I figure I'd talk about like freedom, how that applies to freedom.
Yeah.
And I was hoping to start with like what Skinner thought about freedom. So he thought it was an illusion.
Mm.
He said we're under the control of one thing or another. But
Yeah.
but then he talked about how freedom is a feeling that is generated under very specific environmental conditions. And it's a matter of the contingencies of reinforcement. And the feeling of and arranging these contingencies, you can arrange these contingencies, you can make people feel more free or less free. But I think feelings, like this is my opinion on feelings, feelings are an unreliable guide. If anything, you might go outside. Say I go from inside to outside, I'm in my basement. I go outside. It's daytime outside. I'm going to be like, oh, my eyes, it's like so bright out here, but then I start walking around for a minute, right? And it's not so bright and I'm okay. The sun didn't get any dimmer. It was still the sun. Like it's just the feeling changed. I use this example a lot with my clients. We talk about getting in the swimming pool. I say, "Have you gone swimming before?" "Yeah, sure." "Have you ever gotten in the swimming pool that was too cold?" And they're like, "Yeah." I'm like, "Are you the type that jumps in, or do you get in a little bit at a time?" And they tell me which, and I say, "All right, after you're in there and you start swimming around, like what happens?" And they're like, "Oh, you're not cold anymore." I'm like, "Did the water temperature change?" And they're like, "No." I'm like, "Okay." So the water temperature is the same, but the feeling changed. So how reliable is that feeling and telling you what is going on around you?
That's interesting because my initial thought would be the feeling is accurate for your perception at that time. And then, so like the
Mm.
feeling is accurate for the amount of light that's entering into your eyes. And then as that changes, which I guess the question is, did the environment change? Not necessarily, but kind of did because your eyes are now changing as a result. Or, yeah, that's an interesting thought. I don't know if you wanted to add on that.
I have to go back into my brain and behavior piece, and to some extent, I guess a lot of it might hinge on or be related, associated with your level of arousal or excitement at any given point in time. You might use the word agitation or elation along with that. What's your state of arousal when the stimuli are hitting you, when the sun's hitting your face, or whatever other examples we went over, and I guess how does that then influence your perception of whether it's water temperature or sunshine in your face, or if you're driving, you got enough glare on your windshield and that sun through your face is terrible. You got to bring your sunshade down. But if you're
Mhm.
kicking back by the pool and you just took a cool dip and now you're warming up in the sun, and you're closing your eyes, it's going to be wonderful, right? So yeah, I would go back to again something that it's harder for us to measure. I spent a lot of time doing fMRI research, and that again, that's a lens that measures you're inside a huge noisy magnet. So the idea that that's any sort of typical condition goes right out the window. It's a huge confound. But yeah, the idea
Mhm.
is how prepared, what level of preparedness, excitability, arousal are you at as you're receiving
Yeah.
these stimuli?
Yeah. How we define
Yeah.
feelings, I think,
Yeah.
is kind of important, right? Are we talking about happy, sad, comfort, discomfort?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is really extremely important with my work with clients because they're, coming in and telling me about these like really strong feelings and stuff like that. So, it's important for us to put feelings in a rightful place. And
Sure.
one of the things I say to them is like, I tell them those examples and I tell them about habituation,
Yeah.
right? That like we can have a feeling, then we can habituate to it. And then I talk about feelings as like, yeah, they might be telling us something that's going around us, right? Which is, we are talking about stimulus response relations, so it kind of makes sense. Yeah, they're giving us some information about what's going on around us, but they need to be in the rightful place that we can't trust me, and it doesn't tell us intensity. It's not going to reveal intensity because of habituation.
I think I can
But we also
subscribe to
don't,
that. I think I
yeah,
can agree with that. Yeah, their feelings are very fluid. Yeah, definitely.
yeah, they come and go. Same with thoughts. Thoughts come and go, and they change in a minute. Same with feelings. Feelings can change too. And I guess the most important thing is like you wouldn't want to ignore it. You want to completely ignore it because to ignore that is to be like putting your hands over your eyes or putting your hands over your ears and not listening. So it is like something from the environment that is like and you're getting information from it, but at the same time you can't trust it or let it, guide your actions. There's times every single day where we'll go with the feeling or go without the feeling. You guys might have been in your nice comfy beds this morning, I think, or at least you can imagine sometime that you were, and you probably had the feeling that I don't want to get out of bed, but you did it anyway. And because you had all these important things to do. Mike probably has a kid running around asking for breakfast, or something like that from him. Dan probably has, the female next to him who says, I got to get out, and leave, I have to go home. I didn't know I was going to stay over last night,
Dr. Scott,
and
yeah.
you guys get up despite being comfortable. You go against the feeling. So it's a skill that we all have, but it's also a skill that like I guess the easier thing to do would be to go with it. Like, oh, this feeling is telling me, so I just go with that because that's the information you're receiving at the time. But I teach people to instead of listening to that feeling to sometimes go with it, sometimes go against it. Depends on what they want, what's important for them,
Mm.
with their values and stuff like that, and what they're trying to achieve.
It's
Makes sense.
just a quick aside. It's kind of speaking to our satisfaction currently professionally, but to that feeling, right? I love sleep, and I love when I get a nice deep sleep, and even when I get a good amount of hours and I feel rested, I still have that feeling, right? I wake up and it's like, well, I could lie here a little longer, and it's all good. And my wife's got my daughter, and she's doing okay, and then inevitably these days there's that task, that next thing. Oh, I've got to call so and so. I've got to check in with so and so. I've got to finish this report. I've got to check in with Dan about this. And what distinguishes this now is I guess I've got my own agency, pun intended, But the idea that thank you, the idea that now I want to do these things, so those things propel me to get out of bed. As much as lying down and kicking back and getting more sleep is wonderful. Those are motivating pieces. Where in the past, for whatever reasons, those tasks were always like, oh man, I'm gonna have to interface with so and so. I'm gonna have to persuade so and so about doing it this way and not just kind of going with the standard operating procedure and running the same old thing that has been annoying me or
Did you
whatever
see
it is.
my
But
Teams message?
I did not.
Oh, I was doing billing and I was like,
Oh,
dude, Mike's
my.
notes are all like, I was so surprised. Mike's all caught up with his notes.
Yeah, yeah. There you go. There you go. I am infamous for like, again, from a procedural perspective, just hating the idea of like medical notes or because it always seems so far apart from my value system and saying you're doing this in order to ding me on something to then come back and recoup some money at some point, and I'm doing it for this purpose. And there was always there was a big difference between those two motives. And now I just feel like, hey, I'm going to do these notes the way I want to do them, knowing that just by sheer length and volume, they're probably going to satisfy these folks. So
Yeah,
we're
yeah,
good. We're good, and I feel good about that. So again,
yeah.
I'm feeling a lot of free will. I'm enjoying it.
Oh, so and then I guess certain conditions were arranged,
Yeah,
But
yeah,
like Skinner also thought that he saw freedom as like that escape from aversive control, which is kind of what you're talking about. Here's this
yeah,
aversive control
yeah.
over your notes, and the escape from that and that being freedom.
I
He
like
also
that
saw
too.
like free, yeah. He also saw freedom as no contingencies of aversive control, as in like including like when immediate reinforcers, that are long-term aversives like drugs and alcohol and stuff like that, they can control behavior too. When you think
Yeah,
about it, and I guess you go back to like what Clockwork Orange or whatever, some of
oh,
those old stories.
that
But
I love that movie. We could do a whole episode on
yeah,
the concepts and premises and that idea. I mean, at the end there, we're talking about free will. At the end there, they put him through the ringer and trying to modify his behavior. And at least ultimately for me, at the end there, they didn't really break that spirit, right? The idea
hmm
that he still had that deviancy in him, and it was still underlying, despite now being in full compliance in society in many ways. I forget what happens at the end, but it's sort of they leave you with that spark of like, oh, wait a minute, that guy that same Alex is still in there, that character's still in there.
hmm
So they tried to break his, I guess his deviancy would be the best way to put it, but I think at the end there, the moral is you can't really, that still was.
hmm
I think of it like even in terms of aggressive behavior or hitting, where a lot of times parents will tell me, yeah, we just want that to go away, and it's like, well, yes and no. You don't want it to go away fully. There's an adaptive element to being able to
yeah,
punch somebody, and at some point, you're going to want your kid to be able to do that, although you don't want them doing it, 50 times a day to their sister's face, for example. So.
yeah, no doubt. Yeah, Skinner used to think that like people wanted to be controlled in a very specific way, but I kind of disagree with that
Mhm.
because I think if he also said like he came up with this term counter control, and he saw it as like proof that people would seek to control if it's reinforcing, and that's kind of like the way I see it. Like people would, for the most part, people would rather control than be controlled. But there are situations in which, like, hey, if it's not rewarding to control things, like, if it's like a lot of effort, if someone just, I don't know, you could think of a place where you just want someone else to do it, where it just makes it easier for you if someone else does it.
My
So,
girlfriend
but
and
he
I are
was,
very different in that. So, like, I am like, I will pay people. A lot of times and
to
she just
do things.
wants to do it herself. So yeah, I feel you on that.
Oh, really interesting. Interesting. But Skinner differed from some of the other people in when he was talking about freedom. Baum had some words on it. He talked about free freedom from restraint, like being freed, if you're a servant or slave. And then he also talked about free will as behavior unconstrained by past or future events. And some of the things he mentioned was like really kind of interesting. That like we were talking about free will, and he says free will requires unpredictability, but unpredictability does not imply free will because we have had studies where we've taught pigeons. Page and Nuringer did pigeons in 1985, then Nuringer did humans in 1986. We were teaching people to act more randomly. So I just want to make sure, like, that's not the same thing. Acting more randomly is not like free will. It's not agency. It doesn't like suggest any freedom. It's just acting more randomly.
So
I
is
don't
it
know where it leaves us there.
so is it possible then it's funny, we're talking about free will. I can't help but think of Free Willy, but we talk about free will. So is it possible that there isn't free will, but things could appear to be free will? We just didn't notice the deviation in the antecedent or that person's perception of the antecedent or perception of a potential consequence that led to a different behavior. We're trying to
Well,
make sense of things that don't make sense.
yeah, the literature on, free will too, which Skinner was big on that. Like, and I'm kind of big on that too, to be honest with you, because, if I was going to take a like perspective on it, then I would usually include like relational frame theory and, and how that would frame free will. Because I could ask you guys, and I've done this with my class before, like, could you guys behave more freely right now? Right. And I've had students like were like, yeah, sure, doc, and they kick their feet up and they put their hands behind their head and they're like, yeah, I'm gonna act more freely, or like if you're gonna act in a way that has more free will, and they have an idea what that looks like. They have an idea like where they're at right now and what it would be if they were to be more free or act more free, right? And for me, if they have an idea what that is, then that's certainly some like rule governed behavior that they can behave in a certain way. So I guess it kind of like makes it a thing. You know what I mean? And Skinner thought that too, like that there's that one important thing is the literature of freedom, like that we have, and we should be paying attention to that because it gives us an idea of like what would be free. And even on like our country has this value of freedom. Like,
Yeah.
it's in our national anthem and, we talk about freedom. It's in our important documents and I just want to let you know before I continue, I just feel so lucky talking to you guys about this. Living in the city of Philadelphia, being able to talk to you on the 250th, the year,
Yeah.
the 250th anniversary of our country. I could go downtown, and that's where they did the Declaration of Independence, and that's where they took the stand and like really where freedom in our country really started. So I kind of like see freedom that's like a value of our country. Like if we're going to look at our country as an organization, it's what our nation is really built on, and something that, and it's a value because values aren't goals. Goals are things you achieve and then you're
Mhm.
done. You can check it off your list, but it's something that we continually strive for and we never reach. It's not just a feeling. It could be many feelings. It could include pain and suffering.
Ouch. We got to stop there as this concludes part 2 of our interview with Dr. Scott O'Donnell. Please do ensure you return for part 3 and
always analyze responsibly.
ABA on Tap is recorded live and unfiltered. We're done for today. You don't have to go home, but you can't stay here. See you next time.